Good afternoon from Vancouver, and welcome to this celebration of the publication of Practicing Pragmatism through Progressive Pedagogies, a philosophical lens for grounding classroom teaching and research by Susan Mayer. I'm Kieran Forde, the chair for today, joining you from the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, which is located on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Along with our host, Bill Pinar, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube later today. Let me first introduce Dr. Mayer. Susan, known as Shay to her friends and colleagues, studied elementary education and teaching at Antioch College and then completed her MD at Harvard in learning and curriculum theory. She taught in teacher education programs at Brandeis and Northeastern universities and worked in secondary textbook production for several years. Her work in developmental learning and democratic curricular theory is what brings us together today, specifically the contemporary revival of pragmatism, both as a practical and necessary philosophical stance within democratic schools. Let me also introduce our panelists. Cathy O'Connor, Professor of Education and Linguistics at Boston University, Wheelock College of Education and Human Development, and Mary Kay Delany, Professor of Education at Meredith College, North Carolina. A brief word about format, and then we'll get started. Over the next 20 to 30 minutes, Shay will share a summary of her work with us. Next, Cathy and Mary Kay will each pose a question for a discussion of around 10 to 15 minutes. And afterwards, if there's time left to bring us up to around the 60-minute mark, I'll ask if anyone else in attendance has a question. At that point, you may unmute yourself and pose your question, or at any time you can drop it in the chat and I can read it aloud for you if you'd prefer. Until then, please keep your devices muted and we can get going. So let's get started. Dr. Mayer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kieran. And thank you, Bill, for organizing so many spaces for these conversations over the years. I am going to share some slides, so let me get them up. I'm going to try and get through quite a bit. Well, as you'll gather, it's a complicated book with a lot of parts to it. So I'm going to read a lot of what I've sketched out just to keep us on track time-wise. This is the title of my book. It's a rather long title. I just call it Practicing Pragmatism, which was my original idea for the title. So let me say a few words about pragmatism. I'm actually right here going to read a couple of paragraphs from the book. I think they'll give us what we need to get going. So just even before this, I should say the idea is to, as an educator, speak of a common denominator pragmatism, a kind of pragmatism that is common to the entire family of pragmatisms, which there certainly is. Pragmatism is capacious in that way. You can go, although it's rooted in experience, there are the interpretive lenses we bring as individuals and cultures is baked into the idea of it. So here we go. Pragmatism's simple intuition is that our human knowledge remains forever bound to the contingent circumstances of our human lives. No person's purchase on anything is considered final or even relevant for all times and peoples and circumstances. And the explanations that we as a species construct and the beliefs that we cherish are also recognized to be artifacts of our specific natures and of our locations in space and time. This profound humility in regard to our access as human beings to any form of final or ultimate knowledge is balanced by a stabilizing orientation toward the valuable meanings to be discovered within our experiences as cultured and self-aware beings. Our personal experiences, which are always also enculturated experiences, matter. They provide the material from which each of us, in relationship with others, can construct a great deal of significance, including a sense of purpose and meaning for our lives. So this is the project then that Dewey identifies as the guiding force of a fully realized life. The ongoing work of constructing significant and meaningful understandings in relationship with others and in response to present needs, circumstances, and desires. And Dewey argued, and of course many of us have agreed with him over the years, that schools in a democratic society should aim to set every student on this road, to nurture their sense of themselves as intellectually curious and self-possessed agents. Let's see if, yeah, there we go. In the next 20 minutes, I want to speak of the four main points I'm trying to make with this book and how they connect with each other. While it would be easier by a long margin to just focus on one or the other, the whole intention in writing this book has been to represent how these various areas of concern relate to each other, and to argue that in relationship, they provide a compelling case for transforming public school policy and practice in this country. My first point is that pluralistic democratic societies need pragmatism. In the absence of final or prescribed truths, people need to be willing and able to reason with each other cogently across their various kinds of differences. At the same time, the explorations of the three original authors of Pragmatism, Peirce, James, and Dewey, which vary somewhat from each other, also vary from the philosophical explorations we need today. Rather than dwelling primarily on these original iterations of pragmatism, we all also need to learn from other early and contemporary pragmatists, and to learn ourselves to reason, to be pragmatists, to practice pragmatism, and to reflect and hold pragmatic commitments and values, which are linked directly into democratic worldview. The third point has to do with the ways in which pragmatism has led, and indeed naturally leads, to the values and premises of pedagogical progressivism. Just as the commitments of pragmatism can provide needed clarity and strength of purpose for democratic societies, so progressive pedagogical tradition can provide clarity and strength of purpose for democratic schools. And finally, I argue that the significant and valuable scholarship that has been undertaken over the past half century under the broad conceptual umbrella of classroom discourse research can actually be seen as a response to a call Dewey made for broadly recognizable markers of accomplished progressive practice and for an experimental approach to strengthening progressive classroom practices. So this fourth point moves us from philosophy into the world of social science. Because the claims pragmatists make on others need to be rooted in broadly recognizable human experience, Dewey took the need for grounded empirical studies of progressive classroom practice very seriously. Yet Dewey argued that the kinds of educational research being institutionalized in the academy across the early decades of the 20th century were based on inadequate conceptions of learning and knowledge, and therefore were not capable of speaking to progressive aims and values. So he calls for these new forms that I'm saying we're really starting to have pretty robust set of in the field of classroom discourse. I don't understand why it isn't just me. Oh, here, let me use this to advance. Point one, because evolution was seen as dethroning all forms of absolute truth, the early pragmatists oriented toward a world of collaboratively constructed understandings, one that viewed the different perspectives of different people and peoples as resources and human societies themselves as interwoven ecosystems. There starts to be some interesting work about the extent to which the world itself, the evolving natural world, becomes a metaphor for pragmatism writ large. This vision stands in contrast to that of the so-called social Darwinists, who seized on the phrase survival of the fittest to argue that aggressive predatory species such as hyenas or lions provide the apt metaphor for humankind. leading in the direction of exploitations and human ranking systems of all kinds, which poisoned a great deal of this country's early social science, including educational theory, and whose influences live on. In the book, I cite not just Stephen Jay Gould, but also Anne Winfield's a curriculum theorist who's tracked those influences straight into schools. I say, well, here I actually skip the fact that these two metaphors, society is thriving ecosystem and society is brutal jungle, lead in different directions pedagogically and have. And Dewey argued people have to want to work toward the former in order to bring it into the world. In other words, it can only happen if we make certain kinds of value commitments clearly and universally within our society and in our schools. I say especially John Dewey here in the title of this fourth slide, because Dewey's work is more or less equated with pragmatism in the minds of many, certainly within the field of education. Dewey treated the pedagogical implications of pragmatism and democracy throughout his very long and very prolific career. And yet, like all of us, he was a creature of his time. And in the matter of the white academy of the day, he did not attend to the racial divisions and oppressions that have always structured our social and political life in this country, and which have therefore always stood in the way of any broad realization of his progressive vision for US schools. Many contemporary scholars, people I know, therefore dismiss Dewey and pragmatism as more or less irrelevant to the challenges of our time. So this is the second point I'm looking to make, that we need to reinvent pragmatism for our lives and our time, just as Dewey spoke of reinventing democracy in every new generation. That decentering work of the original pragmatists, which is now occurring, has included study of additional influences, including indigenous influences in the work of Scott Pratt and Bruce Wiltshire, that can arguably be seen to have shaped pragmatism historically, and as it was being taken up in this country in the first half of the 20th century while Dewey was still alive. And in the case of articles in Pappas' book, which is called Pragmatism in the Americas, related thinking that was being explored in Central and South America at the time is being researched, which is all I'll say about that right now. In most cases, I treat these various texts for just long enough to give a feel for the work and how that work suggests pragmatism's greater resonance and continuing relevance for us today. In the case of Alain Locke, Maxine Green, and Eddie Glaude, though, I undertake a deeper consideration of what each of those scholars has given to us, the resources they provide to educators for this moment. This is a three-part framing I use to trace the shifting expressions of enduring progressive commitments from their earliest days in the 17th century, really, to current times: equitable access, meaningful communication, and the triadic relationship, by which I mean the integration of practical activity and firsthand exploration of primary sources into pedagogical experiences. And you really see, I argue, these versions of these concerns and interests across these centuries, and certainly once Dewey starts talking about them. And the work that I just very briefly characterize on this slide, it's happening currently, gives examples from our day. There is a great deal of scholarship now about eradicating deficit assumptions in schools and fostering communitarian values and respectful classroom communities. And this work of, actually, Mary Kay and I are doing some work together on what we call teaching learning research practices, which are pedagogical approaches designed to focus, to really unpack deeply what students are saying and doing in order to, in the process of teaching. So sort of in real time within classrooms and in reflection on classroom experiences, that evening, and the triadic relationship, really, we've always seen progressive educators talking about needing to put students into direct contact with the world. So it's been a century now since developmental learning research first convincingly demonstrated that young people think in qualitatively different ways than we as adults do. In practical terms, this means that young students require more time and space to integrate new material into their existing understandings than adults generally imagine, and that they need to do this in ways that don't seem obvious or natural always to us. So it's helpful, I think, to reconceptualize what we have traditionally called direct instruction as translation work. There's really nothing direct about human communication of any kind, particularly across developmental and cultural divides. In this book, though, I focus more on these other two pedagogical practices, which, as the title of the slide suggests, are also forms of knowledge construction, right? These are ways of constructing understandings in classrooms, approaches to organizing learning experiences. These pedagogical approaches provide students with opportunities to learn to reason actively with each other in order to construct new understandings themselves, in contrast to learning how to make sense of what a teacher is saying, which is also something they have to learn how to do. The problem-solving approach to teaching has arisen primarily in the worlds of math and science education. Students are encouraged to think and talk through challenges in whatever ways make sense to them, and to share their emergent thoughts and theories, and to think about each other's ideas and what they're adding or potential problems with them. In exploratory learning experiences, students are supported in constructing understandings collaboratively based on their direct observations and joint investigations of primary source materials, phenomena. The pedagogical practice of my committee's lead, Eleanor Duckworth, called Critical Exploration in the Classroom, which has been the primary focus of my classroom research and study, is an exploratory form of learning experience. And I don't mean to suggest that, again, these are clean and clear categories. I mean, you can, within a single class period, see different blends of this, and you can characterize any of these in different ways. But this is just three basic, different possibilities, characterized in their simplified forms. So these different forms of learning experience give students a variety of experiences with different kinds of understandings that matter in schools. And in the book, I actually have a discussion about that as well, about how it's useful to be able to talk about different kinds of understandings and the reasons we have for holding them, the basis upon which we have decided that that's an understanding that's useful to us, that's reliable. But here we just have time to consider these three forms of learning experience and how the last two, which are less common, are the ones that give students opportunities to work together, to learn to practice pragmatism, to learn to reason together and study the world together. Needless perhaps to say, such opportunities tend to occur more commonly within more privileged school settings, including the accelerated and advanced tracks of public schools, which is problematic for any number of reasons, one of which is simply that these more interactive pedagogical forms allow students to engage and express themselves in a variety of ways, multiplying their opportunities for learning and growth. So finally, we get to the connection of all of this and ongoing work in the classroom, in the field of classroom discourse study. In the book, I provide a brief history of the field, which can be said to have begun in this country with anthropologically oriented studies of the communicative disconnects occurring in classrooms of Native American students and white teachers. The IRF analysis, which is sometimes also called the IRE analysis, on the left side of the screen there, represents another founding influence in the field. In the mid-70s, two English linguists discovered that the talk in the classrooms they were studying overwhelmingly exhibited this pattern where a teacher would ask a question, a student would say something, and the teacher would provide feedback or evaluate in some manner what the student has said, and then start again. The student wouldn't make another initiation. If we are interested in these more interactive, less teacher-centric forms of classroom practice, though, we need to take a step back. When you think about it, all collaborative constructions of meaning require that someone frame a question or a line of inquiry, and that one or more people generate responses to that provocation, and that these various responses get evaluated in some manner. As I have discussed, from a pragmatist perspective, the question of who is doing this and how, to what ends, are absolutely central. And these are questions that need to be foregrounded and lifted up in educational settings. Where is the authority located? On what basis is authority on this matter established and claimed? There's a lot more that can be said here, but I just am going to share one more slide on this topic to bring these last two together. This slide shows how the framing, developing, evaluating, if we're stepping back and looking at how knowledge is being built in these, using these three phases of knowledge construction, we can use them to compare and contrast these three different kinds of pedagogical approaches we were just talking about. In the translation form of learning experience, the teacher's still going to be framing the questions, most of the questions, and in order to determine whether she's been understood and to make corrections and repairs, elaborations as necessary. In problem-solving learning experiences, the teacher's likely to still be framing the overall inquiry, but we'll be looking for students to pursue that inquiry in ways that make sense to them, and also for them to address each other in assessing each other's ideas and listening to each other's ideas. And so there's a kind of apprenticeship model that the teacher's there, but is looking to mostly turn the work of thinking and evaluating over to the students. In exploratory learning experiences, the students will often assume authority for all the phases of inquiry, and the teacher's role becomes to ensure that the exploration proceeds in a thoughtful, grounded, and transparent manner, and in a generous and fair-minded spirit. So these are just a few other bodies of work that I discuss in the book and that I'm actually writing a paper about now for a conference on positioning theory that combines all of them. This is, again, part of my effort to sort of synthesize and combine work that's being done and that doesn't necessarily even address each other, these communities of practice. You don't necessarily even get people who write and think and, go to conferences with dialogic discourse people will not necessarily know about positioning theory and on and so on. So it's so in conclusion, I am attempting a lot in this book, but I do believe that some of us who claim progressive educational beliefs and values and with backgrounds in progressive classroom practices simply need to figure out how to tell more comprehensive and compelling stories about where those beliefs, values, and practices come from and how they connect with each other. That as a field, we need to find ways of talking to each other across as educators across these these sort of smaller communities of practice, and to reach beyond the academy and beyond the field of education, so that all interested parties can get a sense of the powerful and coherent vision of authentically democratic relations that these established traditions of work represent. Thank you.
Thank you, Shay, for that thought-provoking overview of your work. To follow up, we'll begin with some questions from Cathy and Mary Kay, and after that, I'll invite some of the other participants here to raise their hands, and we'll take some questions from the floor. So over to you, Mary. Over to you, Cathy. And
We
you're
can't hear
unmuted.
you.
How many years will it take me to learn how to unmute myself?
There's always going to be those moments, you know, where you just forget.
Well, let me start by saying I found this book to be amazing. I'm not a student of philosophy, as you know, but it really drew me in to a more expansive way of looking at classroom practice. And the pragmatist view of classroom practice, as you lay it out, really resonated with my intuitions and my hopes. But of course, I have never really explicated those intuitions or hopes. So your casting of pragmatism as the core of a distinctively democratic pedagogical practice set is compelling to me. And it provides a new perspective on work I've done on classroom discourse over several decades, as you know. So I have a question for you, but it is not an easy question. As you argue, bringing inclusive pragmatism into schools leads us directly to the question of what you call interpretive authority. And as you say on page 71, quote, to possess a full measure of interpretive authority means that one has the authority to participate as an equal in framing new lines of inquiry, developing ideas and theories in response, and evaluating one's own ideas and theories and those of others based on respected sources of evidence and forms of reasoning available to all. In pedagogical discussions, being granted a full measure of interpretive authority means that one has been authorized to participate as an equal in the construction of content understandings, which sounds wonderful. And about a paragraph below that, you continue, considerable research has demonstrated that in most classrooms, teachers retain all interpretive authority. They frame the significant lines of inquiry that students address and evaluate which of their students' thoughts and arguments have moved the discussion toward their planned goals for the lesson. Their word is the final word in regard to all substantial matters. Young people can also learn in other ways, though, when they are granted greater shares of interpretive authority. Students can learn to frame their own questions and to evaluate their own and each other's ideas in a principled manner at any age and in relation to any subject matter. In assuming these roles, students are empowered to make learning more relevant, increasing the possibilities that they will take up the perspectives, tools, and acquired understandings and integrate them into their lives beyond school. Such a result directly responds to Dewey's call to increase the cultural power of all students by multiplying their intellectual connections to their worlds, end quote. And the rest of the book, of course, addresses these contexts in looking deeply at classroom discourse. But as you know, and here's the difficult question, when teachers are the center of interpretive authority, it also brings a sense of control over what students can say and do with respect to one another. And when the classroom environment moves closer to the distinctively, quote, distinctively democratic pedagogical practices that you describe, some students may begin to exert their own interpretive power in ways that unfortunately bring in the inequities of the larger society, the racism, the classism, the sexism, the ableism, et cetera, that one finds in abundance in their home communities and sometimes families. Of course, this is incredibly challenging for teachers and might cause them to avoid the forms of classroom teaching and learning you describe, the problem solving and exploratory pedagogical practices. And I've actually written several papers about this problem. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's
Not an
absolutely
easy question.
true. Yeah, it's absolutely true that there's not any one angle on this set of questions, and the work that I'm evoking with my book, and that so many have, I mean, people on the screen with the books they've written. The challenge of creating inclusive and respectful classroom communities is, though, simply essential to any authentic effort toward expanding educational equity. So that's really got to be a starting point if all you ever do is work with the translation form of learning experiences. I think that, you know, a great deal of work needs to be done in this area. I don't think that the work that I've seen, you know, I mean, a lot of people are trying really hard to think about how in teacher education programs in the current circumstances, you can begin to break open students' ideas of what teachers can hold themselves responsible for in terms of moving society forward, and how they are to think about that and approach it. And so what I would say is the contribution I'm trying to make here is that you have to theorize the importance of doing it before you even have a chance of having the space to do it. Teachers have to be able to theorize the importance of doing it, to be in the meaningful conversations they need to be in with their school communities, including possibly their principal, fellow teachers, parent community. And that there are, you know, dimensions of this kind of work, but that the part that you're pulling up and foregrounding right here with your question is sort of the starting point, the most essential piece that has to be so I mean, the only other thing I'll say about it is, and I think I've had these conversations with also people on the screen about the importance, therefore, of integrating a critical sociopolitical analysis on, you know, the state of our schools, the state of our society, so that that gets brought into the picture too. These differences, these, you know, isms that you listed are brought front and center. I mean, I think that's, you've got to do that. In addition to figuring out how to open up classrooms in ways that kids who come up with the unexpected and the challenging and the difficult, and that's the other big piece that's directly implied by my book, are teachers are prepared to listen to and to try and understand, and can create spaces where all of a sudden the dynamics among students can also shift, and they as teachers can see new sides of their students. So it's kind of this cyclical process where you have to be trying to do the work, and you have to do the work a little to realize really what the work is, and to understand that there's these other important, difficult parts of it. And, that work never ends. I hope that felt responsive.
Yes.
Just talking.
Yes.
I'll leave all that there and turn to
Thank
Mary Kay. Thank you for the question, Cathy.
Mary Kay, you'll need to. Yeah.
Yes, that's what I had gotten all prepared and then forgot to unmute. So I am Mary Kay, but I just wanted to say that I am no longer at Meredith College, though it's a beautiful, wonderful place. And I am in Denver on the ancestral lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute. And we also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples. I want to say that I found this book amazingly ambitious, and it was in some places I found myself going back to other texts and reminding myself of what I once knew about this, and now I'm being reminded of again, and of then following these various braids through the text that were so interesting. And as you described in the text, Shay, when we're learning, which I felt like I was a lot reading, that we're looking to connect to what we already know. And so in thinking about the question, I just I have to talk as someone who's been between practice and research for my whole life, and is always playing things back in the classroom. So this is where this question comes from. Like many people in teacher education, I recognize the limits of my position, which is that I am a white woman frequently teaching mostly white women who will be in schools with mostly or a large percentage of students of color or whose backgrounds are different from their own backgrounds. So that is also informing my question. So I thought the focus on developing intelligences and intellectual instrumentalities in the context of the ever-present complexities of what you called for students' whole selves is super important and not very well intended to in many places. And you were talking about Mark Johnson's 2007 work when you said on page 91, in addition to influencing any metaphysical beliefs we may hold, then the submerged continents of our non-conscious thought and feelings, which Johnson references, inform all our own and our students' efforts at formulating and articulating our emergent thoughts and understandings. And I thought that captured what it feels like in part to be in school, both as a teacher and as a student, because it captures that we're not there as just thinkers or just feelers, but in these complex relationships with everything going on with our fellow students when we're a student, with the teacher, with the materials. And so that brought me to thinking about what was described in a lot of places as students constructing identities toward democracy, and that the identity construction is happening in this complex environment with everything that the child brings to school or that the teacher brings to school. And the construction happens in relationship to, again, each other, school, democracy, and community, among many other ways we could think about this. what strikes me in identity, thinking about identity construction toward democracy, is that pedagogy has neglected considering the uneven power relationships that influence identity discussion in school until really recently, and you attend to that, and that these uneven power relationships are systematic, based on race, class, any way, depending on the intersectionalities in the context. And they operate overtly, for example, in state policy that restricts histories that can be taught, and covertly in the unexamined biases that all of us bring to any setting. So I was thinking that when you're looking at Ellen's classroom, that you're seeing identity construction of the students, even when they stop to say, oh, they owned it in the various parts of the battle, and using their own language in that, and their relationship to the content. So then I was thinking about the FDE analysis. So I think that method has a lot of value. So I'm going to read a longer excerpt from page 114 to 115, which is actually about the FDE analysis and thinking about it. In these ways, the FDE analysis has allowed us to characterize structural aspects of this classroom discussion that allow for systematic comparisons to be made with other forms of classroom discussions. By reliably characterizing a significant and under-theorized dimension of discursive variation within a classroom, interpretive authority, the FDE analysis can support researchers' methodical study of the contrasts among different pedagogical forms on this basis and among different enactments of the same form, rather than reducing complicated pedagogical dynamics to imprecise and ideologically driven terms such as teacher-centered and student-centered. Educators can draw upon these types of systematic comparisons to theorize the specific demands and affordances of different discussion-based forms. So in that discussion, I see huge value in that, and having a record of that in Cathy's work and others, and especially when teachers themselves are involved, and that is part of the vision as described in, I think, the first chapter. And what's left hanging for me, and I know examples are little containers, so, and life is complex, and research is a container, and life is complex, one of your points. But in your reading and your vision of education research toward democratic education, where does analysis of systemic barriers to democracy come into play? And maybe you have some ideas about how to go about that.
Feels like it's overlapping with Cathy's question.
I thought that when she was asking.
My mind.
I think so.
Which just, like, I think lifts up where we are right now as a society, and what we're in the thick of. Because, but it also, I have to say, lifts up how limited our social science has been, our approaches, our ways of thinking about classroom practice and correcting practice, making classroom practice stronger, have been so thin. You know, this interpersonal dimension, this embodied dimension, which you referred to, and here I have to thank Jim Garrison, who's on the screen, because he was the one who directed me to Mark Johnson's book, and it was and suggested that I integrate it, which I think was such a big deal. I'm very appreciative. Thank you, Jim. Because of all you're saying, which is that we have to you know, along with all the other things, we have to somehow get ourselves and our teachers, our students, teachers thinking about is being comfortable and being in relationship at a certain level with all the members of a classroom. And that is really not, I mean, that is very personal work. It's very individually oriented work. We come with different strengths, different backgrounds, different limitations, and we teach different groups of kids. It's very individualized on many levels, very specific. So where you start exactly with structural inequities is kind of like, I don't think you can, like with so many other things, really generalize about that more than to say that these different, really transdisciplinary dimensions of the project. And that's why, I ended up in the curriculum studies community and spent so much time there, is because of the call within the reconceptualized field to bring critical, philosophical, historical lenses. When we're in schools, when we're in US schools, like, we need all those lenses. And we need our social science to be just so much better. And I think this, as I was saying, it's what I'm working with right now with some colleagues who are on this call for the Jean Piaget Society meeting, which is on embodiment. The theme is embodiment this year. And we just got to start to think about when we're comfortable, when we're not comfortable, when our students are, how are we constructing the relational systems in our room to be maximally inclusive and to recalibrate the imbalances that, are always going to be there in terms of social wherewithal and social status. So again, I feel like I'm talking a long time. Could talk longer, but does that feel responsive? Is there something more specific you're asking me?
Maybe. So now I'm stumped, but I'm thinking about this kids in a classroom, a group of students, and there are things going on that are telling them they belong, and things that are telling them they don't belong there. And they are sitting there thinking, okay, I don't belong, therefore I'm not part of this project. For example, what do I have in my own, not consciously, but and or maybe consciously as they get older. But and so I guess I'm thinking, if all this is, and we feel this, so where does it fit in pragmatism? This, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And it may just be that I don't know enough.
Well, the only thing I'll say about that now, because that could be a very long discussion, this conversation could just go on and on. We want to hear from other people and other voices, and perhaps other people on the call have an idea about what they want to say in response to that question. But I'll just end by saying that as I was trying to suggest with the metaphor of the ecosystem, the thriving, vibrant, multivariate ecosystem, pragmatism, the organizing construct is healthy growth, and it's and symbiotically growing with the people around you, because their challenges to you, being able to listen to each other and hear each other and respond to each other is going to bring the whole system up, right? So that's like the undergirding kind of the pragmatic worldview. Certainly, as I like most educators draw primarily on Dewey, and in the book also on James, who was a seminal influence on Dewey, when I'm talking about classical pragmatism. And now I'd like to open up the discussion to anyone who has a question or a thought they'd like to share.
Just quickly, perhaps the greatest barrier to, as a general obstruction that can take many forms, is that we tend to think about democracy formally as constitutions, laws, courts, legislatures, presidents, etc. Right. And of course, what Dewey was after was a very participatory, on the ground democracy that one, as Dewey understood it, could execute, in point of fact, in a classroom. And you don't tell your students they vote to learn, but you can certainly create a participatory classroom that helps address the first question. And I think, Shay said she was turning to Merleau-Pontian embodiment. Well, of course, pragmatism is massively embodied from the start in ways that actually dovetail very nicely, say, to Foucault, for instance. Just think of habits. We inhabit the world. We have concrete embodied habits. Easy to tell someone to change their mind. Try telling them to change their habits, which is what that really amounts to. And then you can see the resistance. So at least part of the answer is getting away from formal notions of democracy into more concrete, face-to-face embodied notions.
Yeah, agreed. Carol, it seems to me your work in presence is very much along these lines.
Yeah, I love my man Dewey, but I'm not sure I called myself a pragmatist. These are such ancient questions. I mean, how do you treat each other? How do you listen to each other and acknowledge that you've understood, and waiting for that acknowledgement from the other person that, yes, you have understood. How do you create that learning space in the classroom? I think it's doable. I mean, Carl Rodgers wrote about this way back in the 50s and 60s. Understanding responses and active listening. They're really basic. They're not, they're skills. They're skills that can be practiced in the classroom, and they're hard. When I work with students on really being present to each other, it just, it has to last over at least the course of a course before they begin to get it. And they need a lot of feedback. Another thing I think of is Pat Carini's work, which is really working with teachers on being present to students, on how to really, to function in a democracy, you need to see each other. You need to feel seen by the other.
Right.
So what are the structures we can use in teacher ed to help our students develop that I? And I've found her work to be incredibly powerful. I just finished
15 descriptive reviews that students wrote in my class, and they were, I mean, I cried through half of them. They're just beautiful. So there are ways, I think.
Say a quick word about what a descriptive review is.
Sure. So Pat Carini, if most people don't know her, or I'm not sure, I think people on this screen may. Well, Pat started a school in Southern Vermont back in the mid-60s called the Prospect School. She was a Deweyan, actually. And she worked with her husband, who was a linguist. So she you know, came at everything philosophically. She said, we didn't, in starting the school, we didn't and briefly, a descriptive review includes looking at a child from 5 different angles, physical appearance and gesture, disposition and temperament, connection to others, modes of thinking and learning, and strong interests and preferences. And I take my students through a whole semester of that looking, and it changes them. It changes them. Anyway, I'll be quiet. I'll just say one more thing, since it's quiet. I mean, there's also this question of control and initiative, going back to Cathy's point. Earl Stevick, who was another philosopher language teacher, talked about the difference between teacher control and student initiative, that often the concept is that to give over control to students, agency to students, means giving up control on the part of the teacher.
Yeah.
And what he argued is that you can have 100% of both. The teacher can have 100% control, students can have 100% initiative. And that can flourish. And the teacher there is there to intervene when necessary.
Has to be. And I think that's a really important, very important point to make in all of this, that, interpretive authority is not institutional control. Like they're different wavelengths, different, you can, students can have full interpretive authority going on, which wasn't in the presentation, but from just a couple of the things that got read, people might have gathered that interpretive authority is being able to frame, and I mean, actually somebody read it specifically what it was, to be able to frame questions and also evaluate, being empowered to do the entire piece of knowledge construction. Teacher and text interpretive authority is decentered, but control has to entirely be in place in order to sustain the appropriate quality of investigation, of exploration, of community life. So I think thank you for that. I'm not sure about what our timing is, Bill. Is this?
Well, we are coming up to the hour, and Fiona McDonnell had her hand up earlier, and I think we might make that the last question for the session. Fiona?
If we have time, it was sort of, well, thank you so much for this book, Shay. As I was listening to you, I was thinking of pragmatism. Is it a pedagogical approach for teaching an ideas we already know through experience, like experience is the basis of knowing? Or is it about co-constructing new worlds, knowledge that we don't yet have? And curriculum is ever evolving beyond what we know already, which requires knowing ourselves and the people we're with beyond the word student as whole beings, which means that there isn't a vision of what is, but we have some sense that there's a better world that's beyond what we have already. And anyway, I think some of the challenges I have with language is it's an abstraction from the world. And so I always have that challenge with it. But yeah. So anyway, so the other thing I was thinking when you were talking about teacher and student was this notion in dance called flocking, whereas it goes back and forth. But anyway, that I'm lost in my thinking right now, but thank you for it.
Generally a good thing,
I
yes.
won't take any more time.
Mhm. Well, thank you everyone for being here. It was really great for me. I really appreciate what all of you, it's everyone I can see on the screen, it seems has contributed to, my understanding in some meaningful way. And it's been great to have you here.
Yes, thank you, Shay, for sharing your work with us today, and thank you to our panelists, Catherine and Mary Kay. I dropped a message in the chat there. The session will be uploaded to YouTube later today, and you can see other book reviews and other book launches and some other interesting things on curriculumstudies.ca. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Ciao, Shay. Thank you.